Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the training, learning, and development community. We've got another session for you. And today we are actually getting started a little bit early with the accessible and inclusive design conference that we have starting next week. We have a sponsor for that event for this session. This is Dr. Suzanne Ehrlich, who is with the Unite Design Lab, and we've kind of been going back and forth talking about UDL and things, and I'm really excited to be able to share this like next 30 to 40 minutes with you guys, and we're going to find out more about the Unite Design Lab and Universal Design for Learning, UDL. I know for myself personally, it's, you know, I've had conversations with people in the past about accessible and inclusive design and even universal design, but for some reason it never really stuck. And I think that it's just sticking now for me. I'm fine. Like it took some influences in my life to actually go, wait a minute, we really need to have some serious conversations about this, and we should probably produce an event. So, Suzanne, I'm so glad that you're able to spend some time with us. I know that you're going to be heading out for a week away soon. Yes. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Let's see. Before I get started, let's see. Kara's in, Dawn's in, Shelly's in, Danny. Hey, you guys, thanks for jumping in. Oh yeah, Kara is traveling on the road right now to Kentucky. Very nice. All right.
I'm a super fan of Kara's as well, so the feeling's mutual. So,
all right. Yeah. So let's get started. Universal Design for Learning. What is that, and also just your background too? Why don't you give us that?
I could talk about Universal Design for Learning for days. I think we're going to talk about that, as you said, today. And so I'm enthusiastic, just the idea that people are interested in the topic specific in the space of workplace learning and training and development. And like you said, it's not necessarily new, but its reemergence, if you will, is of great interest to many, including myself. So I am Suzanne Ehrlich. I'm from University of North Florida. I've been there for about 6 years. I've been in instructional design, the field of instructional design for, what would we say, like 15 years plus, and a lot of different roles and capacities. So I know a lot of the conversation goes to what have you done in the field and working with organizations. I work in an academic environment, do academics then do work in the field, and I do both. I've had the privilege of working with nonprofit organizations, working with other organizations on Train the Trainer. It tends to be where my house lies, especially with this kind of work, and working with other organizations and developing their mindset, if you will. We can now more fully identify what that looks like in the last, say, year or two in a lot of our research and work, which led us to the space where I am now program faculty in our master's program in training and development. And that's a thing. And even more so, we're on the heels of having a bachelor's degree in learning design and technology, which is relatively new. And a big part of conversation about how those worlds kind of come together. And just one other additive of my background, which, how did I kind of get there? And I might talk about more my connection to Universal Design for Learning in this space, is I'm a certified sign language interpreter. So I've worked in the field with the deaf community for a long time. And I think that my informal interest in a formal environment just grew over time, over being, an interpreter in the field for 2 decades. And so kind of all these different quadrants come together, and here I am talking about this.
Yeah. And so, your background, you actually have a doctorate in instructional design technology. And so that definitely applies to this audience and our community. And but so how did you get into UDL? Like why how did that kind of like become a focus for you?
Sure. It wasn't, everything happens over time, and we kind of move slowly into our interests. In the field of interpreting, it was very new. And so having the opportunity to apply my knowledge around instructional design and technology. So, I joke, not funny the last year, but funny in the sense that, my doctor was teaching via video conferencing. And then here we were in the last year, leveraging some of those, skills in a completely different capacity and way. And so I've had the opportunity to play in different spheres, really applying some of my knowledge around instructional design and technology, both for academic and in terms of workplace learning. So I think as time has gone on, having a heightened awareness for learners' needs in different environments kept bringing me back to what can I do as a professional to really support the advancement of design in terms of e-learning in a way that really, I know for myself, even personally, in learning environments didn't always match my needs. It didn't support necessarily my capacity, my expertise, my ability to develop. And so what does that look like in an environment where when I think about online learning, I've been in the field for 20 years, it's changed drastically in terms of engagement, right? And so how we can leverage that flexibility. And so I think the technology really has brought this back to center, because the technology has also caught up with, maybe not fully, but at least it's gotten to a point where we can manipulate it a bit more for a larger audience than maybe the static way in which we looked at it, say 20 years ago. I remember the day of correspondence learning with sending CDs to people in the mail and then them coming back. So for those young people listening, times have changed.
Yeah, those young people out there. Now, let me ask you this. So universal design is, from what I understand, is more focused on spaces, right? But universal design for learning, what is the distinction there?
UD has universal design, UD as it's known in the world of architecture and other spaces, has been around for a long time. People in particular in the, say, library, I see some people from the museum world, might be more adept at applying universal design in terms of the physical application. So sometimes people will look at it in terms of maybe the cut in the road, or in entryways, and other ways in which spaces are made more broadly designed for diverse users. And so universal design for learning really came about in a different way. And this was, 20 years ago. This wasn't 2 or 3 years ago, even though it's made a reemergence in how learners move through, say, learning spaces. So when we're talking about UDL in all spaces and places, UDL traditionally has been applied in K-12 spaces. And now we're, with our conversation of bridging what learning looks like in both, say, post K-12 environments, or even post-secondary education, say working in the workplace. Why do these spaces look so differently in terms of how we learn and our practice of training, learning, and teaching? So when you see UDL for looking at the cognitive aspect of how we learn, the how, the what, the why, in which we engage one another in terms of learning, do we offer those different modalities or those different options that might be offered in, say, a physical learning space or a physical space like a library or a museum? And how do we more broadly design for a larger group of learners that we know exist, that there is no average?
Right. So one of the first comments in our chat is from Catherine, and she's an art museum professional specialized in museum education for all ages. And she's interested in UDL and, is interested in this, definitely interested in this presentation. Give us an example, UDL in a museum space.
Sure.
Like, what are some things that you would consider?
Well, I think that, so I'll say this, I will give examples, and we tend to default to, say, checklists, which is pretty traditional in what people are doing. But I will say that, and then we're going to talk about the innovation aspect, that even though I'm going to identify some of the observed practice, there's so much that we're getting in return from having conversations around this that suddenly add more options, right? So just So I think of things like QR codes, for example. It seems like the and some people say, well, I see those all the time and I use those all the time. Well, I would say that it's not yet typical, if you will, in use in terms of accessing documents. The idea that maybe you have something, posted that you could, add a QR code. Multilingualism is a huge component of this as well. The idea that maybe text or audio that's being shared or distributed in learning, e-learning or other spaces is provided in multiple languages. So looking at it from your, multilingual users, do you have that available to them? And that includes maybe even in museum spaces and how that's offered. And those are kind of more the, I think, ones that you'll see more often.
I see.
Yep.
I see. Now, how about for the workplace? Now, you have a lot of focus on workplace, and you had mentioned already talking about innovation. But why is applying UDL to workplace learning important now?
Well, if our ultimate goal is to support and advance employees and practice and our colleagues work in the most successful space, then providing an opportunity for learners to succeed in that environment without identification. So while UDL has been traditionally provided and used and applied to support people with disabilities, it really has moved to a completely different space in terms of equity and access for a broader range of individuals who might have barriers to learning. And those barriers can look different. And so we're starting to look at how would we define a barrier to learning? Does a barrier to learning mean access to technology? It was really a pretty significant one this last year, where being physically home, some people just simply didn't have what they needed in order to access, whether it would be internet access that became a big one, or other things that becomes, consideration in how you design. So are you then designing for low bandwidth and high bandwidth as a consideration for UDL and framing it, so that someone might be able to download a text instead of reading it maybe and participating synchronously. So even this, we have people who are participating in different modalities. They might be listening, they might be watching, modalities being a part of that. And so I think for a long time, our technology has driven how we look at learning and perhaps workplaces. And now hopefully that tide is, and for many, it might have already shifted, that we're the drivers, and the technology where originally it was housed was supposed to be the support, not necessarily the guiding aspect of what we do. But if we get into the whole world of LMS and UDL, well, we'll be in a whole nother hour. So
I'm sure, absolutely. And let's connect that innovation piece to it. So, where does that come into play for an organization that starts practicing UDL, in their workplace? How do you see innovation occurring because of that?
So I think it's great. I think sometimes it's directional in terms of top down or bottom up conversation. So you might have, say, one particular employee attends a session and is really excited about the topic of universal design for learning and how that might actually support equity and access in their workplace around training and development. However, when that training or that understanding is maybe more broadly understood, the investment may not be there in terms of infrastructure and system. Right. So really getting into that larger conversation around what is the value for our organization in implementing not just universal design for learning, but a universal design for learning mindset. How do we then, and I think inclusive mindset and design thinking, a lot of these are all kind of part of that same family of advancing our practice through innovation. And it's just a different lens for which to look at it. And I think they're all very complementary and have kind of grown from one another. I would, say that, our knowledge of those areas have advanced some of our practice.
I could see how the innovation can result from that, from just changing your mindset. In fact, you mentioned an outward mindset. Yeah, and I know I read some of one of the articles that you'd written. When you're talking about that, what exactly does that mean? The outward mindset.
I absolutely love, and I actually teach a universal design for learning class in our program, and it's one of our number one texts. And the realizations that come from our students as a result of that text really come from a space and a place of, and not to oversimplify the text. And I'm looking for the reference here. Arbinger, I believe, is the reference here too. I want to give kudos at where it belongs, but that when we think of solving a challenge or issue, but we're doing so not in a way that takes away from our other tasks, right? That the looking outward and support for other learners doesn't take away, but actually adds and complements what's happening. So there's a great example at the beginning of the book, which I may not do justice, in which they were talking about a SWAT team that goes in and having to deal with situations that occur during those raids. And their attention was put on the raid itself instead of the people who might be kind of peripherally impacted in terms of children that might be present. And could you actually care for all at the same time and not necessarily focus only on the task of it's pretty significant story that kind of, takes you through that whole idea of you can look outward, right? You can see the experiences of others. And that has really, I think, excited our interest around even empathy mapping as a significant component to how we look at universal design for learning implementation. And some people may be familiar with that or may not, but I think empathy as a topic in general has become, and wonderfully so, a real priority for many in terms of learning design as of late.
Right. That's really interesting because never really considered that when you're building a curriculum or building, even just if you're an e-learning professional and you're creating like a simulation or something, if your typical mode is to just think about like what you were interested in building and how you think it would be cool, but then all of a sudden making the shift to outward, that is actually a pretty dramatic like change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to touch on Danny's point. The design mindset is difficult to shift. It is the whole center, I would say. Well, I shouldn't say the whole center, but a big portion of why we are now exploring, or at least early development of a train the trainer around these particular topics. Mm-hmm. We know that training is essential. I mean, here we are talking to all of those who participate in that in some fashion or form, whether directly or indirectly, in the power of training and development. And so our thinking is the same, is that we have been lucky enough to see how that challenge might actually feed more innovation in terms of how do you then shift that mindset. So that is definitely another area of interest that aligns with our Unite Design Lab, which we mentioned before.
Right. Okay. And we'll be talking about Unite in a bit as well. But I'm wondering too, like I saw that there was something in the article that talked about how that there's a gap in research for exploring UDL in the workplace. Like it looks like there's research available for higher ed, K through 12, but in the workplace, not so much. Is there a reason for that?
So I would say that sometimes it looks different. It's not that people aren't necessarily researching it, but maybe in whatever it is, I always joke, the it factor of UDL, when we talk about it as an it happens quite often. But the it factor, I think that oftentimes we are in motion and in practice, and maybe we're not necessarily, collaborating in that way and in that space. I think that's really where our heart lies, is that we would like to amplify and magnify that both practice and research, and how those two quite often are necessary for one another and complement one another, and making that more visible to the community. Because it's not necessarily that people aren't engaged in this practice. And I think that your, awesome event that's coming up will highlight exactly how that's happening. But how we are really, doing so with evidence-based research, because we struggle with the same, that we know that we're onto something. We know that we see the patterns in shift in terms of practice, but how do we document those in a way that identify best practice? So that's really where our future lies, in terms of not just our own, but highlighting those in the community that are engaged in that. So I would imagine that, like everything that I've observed in academia, that trends set the pace for a lot of funding and research. And so I would imagine the same is here. So I think even, noting our last week or a week or two presidential executive order
Right.
on, what I believe it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the federal workforce. It's moments and statements like that that help set the pace for maybe what's to come in terms of research and collaboration in the field.
No, I love it. And why don't we talk about that real quick? Because I do have that on my list to talk about that executive order. Tell us more about that. And it's actually, I hadn't heard it until you had messaged about it in an email.
Well, I'm excited because for us, sometimes that means forecasting for funding, and funding means if we can get a hold of money, that means we reach out to organizations and groups to collaborate. And then I think a lot of the innovation comes from those spaces and places as well. So, sometimes I know the partnership between education and workplace isn't always so perfect, but I know many players in the game who are interested in creating greater bridges there, because I think we have a lot. I'm very passionate that we have a lot to learn from each other on both sides of the house, being lucky enough to play in both spaces. But specifically, there's a lot to read around what their vision is for this and what was documented. But there's a whole section 9, that talks specifically about training and learning and the language of reducing barriers. So I think that, with, the activity that we've seen in the field and the continued support for these changes in practice. Again, going back to Danny's, it is difficult to make that shift, but a lot of these pieces help to, I think, lay the foundation to make that shift. And change is slow. I would love to change faster, but and it's even slower in academia sometimes. So I'm used to slow change, but good change can be slow change too.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to, I will definitely need to share out that executive order, because I want people to be able to understand that that's pretty significant, and I just keep wondering, I know that Sherry Byrne-Haber, who is going to be opening up AIDC 21, she wrote a book about sort of myths as to why you can't implement accessibility in your organization. But, will implementing UDL into your into your skill set actually just make you a better instructional designer?
I say absolutely yes. I have, between the trainers and the teachers that come to my class, I think that the start of that 16 weeks, there's usually the reaction to, this sounds like so much and I can't do all of this. You're asking too much. And then to the end of just having the opportunity to make +1, which is Thomas Tobin, who has great work around the idea of how you make incremental change. But that you just, you think about what your foundation already is and building on your existing skills. So it's not changing it 100% and doing a 180-degree turn. It is the idea that whatever foundation you have, you can build upon that. I think sometimes getting to the point of being open to the opportunity for that change is probably the biggest step. And then the rest kind of falls into play in terms of building that skill. And then what's some of these trainers and teachers discover is this actually makes my planning a lot easier and more effective. Yes, we know that. We see that, but that's back to that evidence-based practice. We have really great evidence in K through 12 or K through 16, but really excited about the idea of seeing that also occur in post, academic life.
That's really interesting. And I had a guest on a few weeks ago, Jamie Villanueva, who's a freelancer in Silicon Valley and a freelance instructional designer. He basically has jobs thrown at him constantly. And he had a recommendation for, like, if you at all can, like, add accessibility skills to your toolkit, do it, because as soon as people see that, you go to the top of the pile as far as resumes are concerned. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Absolutely. And I think even the growing distinction between accessibility and UDL has become quite interesting. So that's a great conversation in terms of the proactive versus reactive mindset, which I would even argue that some of the accessibility experts are actually UDL experts by virtue of their thinking proactively. Because accessibility is a response to a particular need oftentimes, or very specific in terms of the accessibility world, in terms of maybe web page accessibility and so forth. Whereas UDL is this, multiple modalities, neuroscience-based action in terms of practice, that I think the two really are quite complementary and necessary for one another. And so,
Thanks for making that distinction. I was wondering about that, the difference between both, and that is there. But it's nice to hear that UDL folks potentially have accessibility skills already built in.
Yes, absolutely. The potential's there.
Yeah. So building the UDL mindset, how do you even start? How do you start building that?
Well, I think from our own practice, in terms of some of the training and education that we've done, it's really started from a policy and guideline aspect. The identification of language. This comes partly from my interpreting background, that semantics and language matters. That how have you identified a UDL voice within your organization, whether it be in a unit or whether it be in an entire organization? What does that language look like when you are reducing barriers for learners, when you're looking for those opportunities to pattern that practice throughout? So I think of things like a great example is within one unit, we had a need for distribution of any materials prior to attending a meeting, and that has to do with accessibility for a particular faculty member. And so the practice became just sending out all materials before all meetings at all times, the universal design approach. And it really became a mindset, because it was why do I have to send everybody this all of the time? And so getting into that conversation regularly, and it was one point in one practice, but then it became part of our language and our policies within the organization. That how do we then give voice to that in terms of patterning those practices throughout the organization, not just for that one individual, but for all individuals who may not identify or express their need, or who simply might benefit from having that information ahead of time and being prepared. So I think that really for us, it's organizational discussions around where does that language appear, whether it be in your planning, whether it be in your storyboarding, whether it be, you name it, where are you engaged in those conversations?
That's fascinating. Very, very interesting. And of course, that would be something that potentially you could learn from the Unite Design Lab. Yeah.
I would like to think that's the dream.
Yeah. So let's give me the rundown on the Unite Design Lab. Let's hear about it.
Sure. So even you talk about language and the value of language, I've enjoyed the conversation with colleagues around, well, we have this new lab. It's called the Unite Design Lab. And the first question is, well, where is it? Well, it's digital and it's virtual. Well, what room are you going to get? Well, we're not going to get a room. And so it's revealing in terms of our, how we define space. What does it mean to look like a collective? Can a collective exist in, this digital world? And that's really where we are living. And our hope is that creating this space, and it's really at the very baseline right now. So for us, it's a matter of pushing out the conversation with our website. And we've been quietly building behind the scenes and connecting with potential external board members to frame the work that we're doing, inviting members who are in the field doing the work, so that we can develop a train the trainer, and that we can create these, hopefully in the future, events where the conversation can happen both within, not just strictly academia. I think that's kind of an assumption because we're housed there, but for organizations worldwide who want to engage and make this shift in their training and development spaces.
Nice. So are you currently offering any trainer programs, or it's still in development?
So the goal is a fall launch. We actually have a pilot group that we hope to engage with at the late summer. So that's ambitious, but we do want to pilot and test it out. So if you think that you want to, be a part of that, reach out to us. And reach out to me directly as well. And I'd be happy to, connect and share more. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. All right, great. So then last question here. One, I want to thank you for being a sponsor of AIDC 21. I really appreciate you helping support the event. We've got like over 500 people registered. Very excited about that. I actually didn't think I thought we might get half of that. So this is good. And we've still got this whole next week to wait for registrations to come in. Now, as a sponsor, what are you looking for from us? How can the community kind of help with what you're doing? And we appreciate your support. What are you looking for right now?
I think for us, we're just really excited about supporting the conversation.
Okay.
I don't know yet officially what that looks like. I mean, there are a lot of ways, or I should say a lot of strategies of, organizationally speaking, on how you can foster that in a more formal way. But I think the informal aspect of what we do in terms of conversation and being a part of this conversation, even for this event, for internally, even in talking to our PR folks, they said, you've got to do this. This is an exciting opportunity to see this large group that are really excited about that similar, idea. And so I think for us, we're just looking for greater connections in the community to engage in deeper thinking around this and how to improve practice.
I'm afraid to ask this, but are you going to be there?
I'm hoping to.
Can I be back in time?
I'd like to.
Okay.
That's the goal. I hadn't signed up officially yet, but
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I didn't know because I knew you were going to go away.
No, that I can make space for.
Okay, good. All right. So yeah, because your voice in all of this would only help enrich the event. So definitely would love having you there. So please make sure you join us. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for spending time with us. Now, your partner in crime couldn't be here today, right? So
yes, Dr. Michelle Bartlett is also, you can read about her bio, but she is just a heap of fun and passionate about this topic as well. And I'm pretty sure, fairly confident she'll be there next Friday as well.
Right. And if you have any, ideas and you want to engage with the training, learning, and development community about other things related to this, please feel free to reach out. This is something that I know for myself, I'm really trying to, like even this platform right now, no closed captions, or all these things that are missing for me now. And I'm like, oh boy, I've been here for like 4 years. Am I going to have to like move to something completely different? And those are really, those are big decisions that I have to make, but I can't see a reason why I shouldn't do a lot of these shifts. And just even in my daily activities, I'm just looking at, I never used to look at alt text before. And I'm like, oh, fill that out.
Right. It's exciting though. I think that, for us, it's a welcoming and supportive approach to, we want people not to be afraid of it and to embrace it and to want to engage in deeper conversations on the challenges like posed here. So we're excited about that. And it sounds like you're really on your way. So it sounds great.
Fingers crossed. All right. Hey, good luck with the Unite Design Lab. And
thank you so much for this opportunity
this next week. Yeah. And hopefully we'll see you online at AIDC 21 next week. Thanks everybody for joining us today. Shelly, Danny, I see Q is in there too. Judy, take care. And we'll see you next week. Everyone.
Appreciate it, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.